Welcome to the World Christianity Project. We're thrilled you're with us here today. It'll be my honor to give today's lecture entitled Periodizing, the Era of World Christianity, and yes, I'll explain that title. We have with us the honor also of having Dr. Alan Ye, who will be one of our respondents, one of our panelists. Dr. Ye is the Associate Professor of Intercultural Studies and Missiology at Biola University. Also with us is Byron D. Klaus, President and Professor of Intercultural Leadership Studies at Assemblies of God Theological Seminary. And we also have with us Darren C. Marks, Assistant Professor of Theology at Huron University College. I'll give each of them a more full introduction when we come to the panel part of the lecture. Periodizing the age of world Christianity. Let me tell you what I'm going to tell you before I tell you, just to make things especially clear today. I'm going to ask one question. The question is this: if world Christianity is an era in the history of the church, and many are starting to argue that it is, if you follow textbooks in church history, which I do as a professor of church history. If it is an era, if world Christianity represents an era of the history of the church, then when did it begin? Or with Philip Jenkins, whose subtitle from his book, The Next Christendom, is The Coming of Global Christianity, is it yet coming? If global Christianity is a phenomenon that is yet to arrive, how will we know it when it's actually here? Now, please don't mistake what I'm saying. I actually am a firm believer in world Christianity. I would agree with Gene Green, who gave the last lecture in this series, that we're looking at something almost as large in significance as the Reformation, or potentially so. But if that's the case, why don't we start applying the discipline of history, the tools of history, to start sorting all of this out? Not because at the end of the day, we're writing church history textbooks and we need to know when this period starts, although some of us are doing that. But much more significant in this exercise is as we apply the tools of history to this discourse, we're going to learn some interesting things. Historians look at continuity and discontinuity, and that is really what I'm after. With this new era of world Christianity, where's the continuity with past ages? After all, we do believe in Catholicity. We do believe in Orthodoxy. Christian tradition, if it's apostolic, will have a lot to do with what's come before. But then also, what are the points of discontinuity? What's genuinely new about this movement? And what should we get behind and celebrate with all of our energies and joy? So that's where I'm headed. Hans Lietzmann, the famous 20th century German professor of church history, formulated the excellent piece of advice that historical problems that seem unresolvable should be addressed not merely historically, but also historiographically. That is, in other words, in instances in scholarly discourse, and in his case in historical discourse, where scholars could achieve little agreement on how this historical phenomenon unfolds, scholars should rather focus not just on the historical debates, but rather on the way these debates are being written. It's time to step back and look at methodology. Now, the study of world Christianity is still relatively new. So although some are positing world Christianity as a moment in church history, it is nonetheless a very new one. Non-specialists, so those who have not been studying missiology all their lives, have come to the awareness of world Christianity perhaps only in 2002, when Philip Jenkins published his landmark study, The Next Christendom. And I found this very interesting. I was looking at different reviews of this text. I read it a number of years back too and was thoroughly enthralled with it. It's an amazing and bold book. But as I was looking through various reviews of the text that came out around the time when it was first released, what I was amazed by is while everyone could say that, yes, this book was prophetic, had something extraordinary to say, almost no reviewer left the text without making major critiques of its direction. Almost no reviewer. If we didn't know that this book was going to be a bestseller and be so widely received, looking just at the reviews afterwards, you would have thought there was substantial and troubling disagreement between the reviewer and Philip Jenkins. We all agree that world Christianity is coming or perhaps already here, but what does it look like and where is it going? When we start asking those questions, we're going to land on substantial disagreement, and that's what I want to continue to facilitate that conversation in this specific lecture. First of all, let me introduce you to some bibliography in the study of world Christianity. There's been a number of pieces done on the historiography of world Christianity over the last decade or two. So let me introduce to you to some of that. Laman Sana, a name that I think all of you are getting to know well in this class, wrote this way back in 1995. I wonder what the study of church history would look like if it had a global perspective, if it viewed world Christianity not with a sense of decline and uncertainty, but with a sense of expansion and promise. Indeed, might not the entire structure of theological education change if it began to respond to the realities of world Christianity? 20 years ago or 19 years ago doesn't seem like that long ago, but in this field, that's the Dark Ages. That's a long time ago. In 1995, only specialists were talking about the development of world Christianity. Also, I want to introduce to you a couple other pieces. Hans Sills, Jehu, who wrote New Wine and Old Wineskins, Critical Reflections on Writing and Teaching a Global Christian History, back in 2006. Fascinating piece from a native of Sierra Leone. Also, Wilbert Schenck put together, a professor of missiology, I believe, at Fuller Theological Seminary, wrote Enlarging the Story, which was a series of papers that came out of a colloquium, I think in 1998, at Fuller Theological Seminary on how to write history given the context of global Christianity. And this book is a marvelously helpful tool also, Perspectives on Writing World Christian History from Enlarging the Story. Perhaps most useful in my regard was a short little essay that Dana Robert wrote, Historiographic Foundations from Latourette and Van Dusen to Andrew F. Walls in Understanding World Christianity. I was particularly taken with her approach. Dana Robert talks about three major historians who helped give birth to our understanding of what world Christianity is. So before I actually try to do history on world Christianity with you, let me introduce to you to what's already been done and where we'll begin our particular reflections for this moment. According to Robert, and I found her argument entirely compelling, Kenneth Scott Latourette, longtime missionary in China and then professor of mission history at Yale University, really gives rise to the historiography that's going to develop into what we're calling world Christianity. Robert portrays Latourette as the creator of mission history, writing a 7-volume magnum opus, laying out a single narrative of the history of worldwide mission, and with his considerable exposure to Chinese culture as a missionary there, was entirely aware that the way that we view theology here in the West isn't necessarily the way that it is viewed elsewhere. Latourette represents a pre-World War II vision of world Christianity, one that represents a very optimistic approach. This world Christianity is leading us towards an ecumenical hope that possibly even could be reunification in the church. There was true ecumenical hope around this time. And that ecumenical project, as envisioned by Latourette, was primarily to be dominated by or facilitated by mainstream Protestant denominations. Those were going to be the main players in this new church that was developing and growing. Another theologian and historian who also helped give birth to this paradigm of world Christianity would be Henry Pitney Van Dusen, president of Union Theological Seminary from 1945 to 1963, who orchestrated the creation of the Henry W. Luce Visiting Professorship in World Christianity at Union Seminary in 1945. That's pretty progressive, creating a professorship of world Christianity in 1945. No one else was doing this. He wrote, in fact, the book entitled World Christianity, Yesterday, Today, and Tomorrow, and that came out in 1947, the year before the World Council of Churches was founded. Now, while Van Dusen was using this terminology of world Christianity, that only caught on a few years ago, a very few years ago. I think it was 2009 when at Edinburgh University, the Center for the Study of Non-Western Christianity, founded by Andrew Walls, whom I'll mention in a moment as well, it was only in 2009 that that institute changed its name formally to the Center for the Study of World Christianity. And there's been this debate between missiologists in the field. Do we call this world Christianity? Do we call it global theology? In fact, there seems to be some sort of in-house fight, if you will, about the correct terminology that we should use. I'll tell you a funny incident. I had one of my assistants contact La Manzana, this was probably over a year ago, and asking La Manzana to join a particular project that I was working on at the time. I was asking him if he'd give us an interview. And it was reported to me that the email came back from Dr. La Manzana's desk at Yale University. Sorry, I don't know anything about global theology. Thank you very much. Period. And as we were in the office trying to sort this out, what do you mean? He's the poster child, if you will, for global theology. What's going on? Well, we learned quickly that there's an in-house fight about, is this global theology? Is it world Christianity? World Christianity? And so you can see that La Manzana clearly prefers one of those terms, now doesn't he? I don't know anything about global theology. Is global theology just the McDonaldization of theology? Is it world cliche culture imposing itself? Is this a new form of cultural imperialism? As David Wells would be asking prophetically in his book, No Place for Truth in 1993. Is this world cliche culture, or is this an expansion of the witness of the church? Okay. Van Dusen was well ahead of his time, not only in using those words, world Christianity, but a creator of what they've come to mean. Last architect in the historiography of world Christianity would be Andrew Walls, again a name that you're knowing well at this point in the class. Walls founded the Center for the Study of Christianity in the Non-Western World in 1982, again renamed Center for the Study of World Christianity in 2009 at the University of Aberdeen. Now, let me ask you a question. Given that historiographical background, let me ask you a multiple choice question. Which of the following historical events signals the beginning of the era of Western Christianity? And I would like you to reflect on, I'll give you 6 responses. You can make up your own if you care. So again, if we were periodizing this era of world Christianity, when does it start? Is it A, the Reformations of the 16th century? Is it B, the Azusa Street revival of 1906? Is it C, the Edinburgh World Missionary Conference of 1910? Is it D, the founding of the World Council of Churches in 1948? Is it E, Vatican Council II, 1962 to 1965? And last but not least, is it F, the International Congress on World Evangelization of 1974? I will talk you through, very briefly, all of those potential answers, and I want you thinking hard. Which one would you put down on a test? Because you never know. There might be a test with this on it. Actually, no. This is just a thought question for our exercise. But let me talk you through the potential answers here, because this is a very serious question. And then as we get to the end, what I'm going to invite our panel members into is a reflection on with me about the questions really lurking behind this question. So if we were to choose this or that, what theological trajectories are we surfacing as dominant in the narrative of world Christianity? And I trust this will be a very useful exercise for us. Let's reflect on position A for the moment. Is world Christianity a direct outflow of the Reformations of the 16th century? And I'm using that word Reformation plural, in the plural because I mean consciously both the Protestant Reformations and the Roman Catholic Reformations, sometimes called the Counter-Reformations, the Counter-Reformation. The 15th and 16th centuries were certainly a time of unprecedented geographical expansion for the Western world. Fearless, seafaring explorers opened up European awareness of North and South America and sub-Saharan Africa. Justo Gonzalez can write this: Two cataclysmic events dominated the history of Christianity in the 16th century: the Reformation and the colonization of vast new lands. Most church historians have paid more attention to the first of these than to the second, but the truth is that to this day it is impossible to tell which of these two will ultimately have a greater impact on the future history of Christianity. Is what we're experiencing and beginning to name with some regularity world Christianity, is that simply an outflow, a direct outflow of the spiritual energies of the Reformation, the expansion, the global expansion that we saw during this time, the bringing of theology to a host of new peoples? Now, the Catholic Reformation reflects the expansive spirit of the age that thrived in the southern European countries of the 16th centuries. The Jesuits, I'm sure you remember, are bringing in a new age of missionary activity. Never before in world history, church history, had we seen an expansion of a religion so aggressive, so broad in such a short period of time. And there's, of course, a direct relation to the Jesuit missionary activity and the Reformation that's taking place. The Jesuits were, after all, the stormtroopers of the Counter-Reformation. They were going to bring the Roman Catholic faith to new lands as their own territory on continental Europe was being hashed up or divided up among the Protestants and the Catholics. We as Protestants can sometimes forget that William Carey is born no fewer than 205 years after the death date of Ignatius of Loyola. Loyola was in glory for 205 years before the father of Protestant missions is even a child. And I want to counterbalance perhaps a Protestant bias here. We tend to think of the missionary activity the great ages of missionary activity is the 18th and 19th centuries, following no less of an authority than Kenneth Scott Latourette. But what about the Jesuits? The Jesuit missionary activity flows directly out of the Reformation. And in some way, then, is what we're experiencing now simply a continuation of that story? Let me talk through with you option B. Again, the question being, when does world Christianity begin, the period of world Christianity begin? What about this option? What about the Azusa Street Revival of 1906? It was in 1906 that William J. Seymour, an African-American minister, led a revival meeting in the Apostolic Faith Mission on Azusa Street in Los Angeles. He had studied the year prior at Charles Parham's Bible School, where he had learned about glossolalia, or speaking in tongues, and he began to preach on the subject in his revival meetings. Many signs and wonders were soon reported at these meetings, and the Pentecostal movement had been born. An interracial movement from the very beginning, an interdenominational movement from the very beginning. Pentecostalism spread across national and ethnic borders with an unprecedented ease and pace. Is, in fact, the Azusa Street Revival the beginning point for world Christianity? It was in 1958, so continue to reflect on that thesis with me. It was in 1958 that Henry P. Van Dusen, who had been very influential in the creation of the World Council of Churches just 10 years prior to that, and who was then serving as the president of Union Theological Seminary in New York City, that he writes an article that appears in Life magazine with the title, The Third Force of Christendom. This is in 1958. The Third Force in Christendom. And the thesis of this article is that Pentecostalism, and it's very interesting to see the way that Van Dusen conceives of Pentecostalism only 60 years ago about, and today already those are very different views. The thesis of the article is that Pentecostalism, and he conceives of it as this broad swath of, quote, fringe groups, acts as a third branch of Christianity. So along with Roman Catholicism, or along with Protestantism, and forgive Van Dusen for forgetting the Eastern Orthodox at this point, is there a third branch of Christianity, the so-called third force? And I'm intrigued by Van Dusen's language because he doesn't know what to call them. World Christianity, although he had written a book 9 years ago with that title, still didn't seem like an appropriate designation for what Van Dusen was describing. Apparently, he doesn't find any suitable name for the group, and he consistently refers to this loose coalition of churches as third force churches. He estimates their presence to be about 20 million worldwide, a number that seems awfully small when we look at Pentecostal numbers today, but Van Dusen estimated that there were about 14 million Pentecostals outside of the U.S. and about 6 million inside the U.S. And he writes this. Van Dusen's words are almost prophetic. He asks this question: what are the movement's prospects? No one can foretell whether this third force will persist into the long future as a separate and mighty branch of Christianity, or whether it will ultimately be reabsorbed into classic Protestantism, as many spokesmen of the latter prophesy. Parenthetical statement, is their wish father to their thought? Until lately, only Protestants regarded the movement as a temporary and passing phenomenon, not worth much attention, Van Dusen continues. Now there is a growing serious recognition of its true dimensions, and probable permanence. The tendency to dismiss its Christian message as inadequate is being replaced by a chastened readiness to investigate the secrets of its mighty sweep, especially to learn if it may not have important, neglected elements in a full and true Christian witness. The way that Van Dusen conceives of this group that he's observing growing up is that it's another branch of Christianity, like Roman Catholicism, like Protestantism, and that's basically the historiographical position that Andrew Walls is going to inherit as well. Is world Christianity, along with Roman Catholic Church and the Protestant denominations, a new branch of Christianity? All right, let's look at option C. Is the Edinburgh World Missionary Conference of 1910 perhaps the best answer to that question? When does world Christianity begin? In the words of Kenneth Scott Latourette, this is famously remembered as the birthplace of the modern ecumenical movement. The conference is held from June 14 to June 23rd of 1910. It's attended by some 1,200 delegates from mission societies from across Europe and North America, and presided by John Mott. It was a fitting conclusion for the, quote, great century of Protestant missionary expansion and a promising introduction to the ecumenical hope of the 20th century. An enormous amount of theological reflection went into this conference. It was truly a landmark event. 8 committees of 20 persons each studied specific topics related to the conference. After the conference, 9 volumes in all were published containing the work of this conference, 1 volume from each of the 8 committees, plus a final volume containing the proceedings from the conference lectures. The 8th Commission studied, quote, cooperation and the promotion of unity, what seems to be a prophetic title, given that in 1960, 50 years later, as Rome is preparing for the Vatican Council II, Pope John the 23rd would create the, quote, Secretariat for the Promotion of Christian Unity, from which the Pontifical Council for the Promotion of Christian Unity today has been formed. The ecumenical movement is clearly on the move. It clearly grows out of the mission movement. It's almost as though this World Missionary Conference is the closing bookend of this great century of missionary activity and the first bell, if you will, of this awakening dawn of the ecumenical optimism of the early 20th century. On that same note, could we consider option D, the fourth of our six options? Was the founding of the World Council of Churches in 1948 perhaps the beginning of the period of world Christianity? What would justify such a response? What could we learn from working with this idea or this thesis? Well, there was something tremendously influential, everyone would have to admit, with the closing of World War II. Even the idea of a world war, the world had become so interconnected that war as another activity of man was something that the entire world engaged in. Those who look for a beginning point for globalization will usually take globalization back to the colonies, the period of these trading companies back into the 1600s and so on. But the close of World War II is a landmark in the development of globalization, the development of a global community and what comes out of that. The founding of the World Council of Churches in 1948 is also that landmark, that concluding landmark in the mid-20th century. The World Council of Churches held its inaugural Congress in Amsterdam in 1948. John Mott, whom I've already mentioned, was the honorary president of the World Council of Churches, although Wilhelm Visser Tooft was the first Secretary General of the World Council of Churches. Visser Tooft had traveled with John Mott in 1925 when he had been back into the USA, and Visser Tooft had been intimately involved with the World Student Christian Federation. The World Council of Churches, too, if you go onto their webpage, in their brief history of their organization, will trace its history partially back to the World Missionary Council, the Edinburgh World Missionary Conference of 1910. For time's sake, let me move a little bit more quickly, but let me introduce to you two other possible candidates. And because I think that these events are also probably better known to us, I'll justify a shorter response and description of what trajectories were at work in these landmark events. What about Vatican II? Vatican II, 1962 to 1965, is a possible beginning point for what we call world Christianity. It was the only ecumenical council, the only council recognized by the Roman Catholic Church to be ecumenical since that of Trent in the 16th century. There's an obvious bookending going on here. What happened at Trent is being revised by what the Catholic Church is promulgating in its dogmatic constitutions in the mid-20th century. Something very large is afoot to awaken that sleeping giant. The 21st Ecumenical Council, according to the Roman Catholic counting, the council was called by Pope John the 23rd on October the 11th, 1962, concluded by Pope John the 6th on December 8th, 1965. The council produced 4 dogmatic constitutions, De Verbum, Lumen Gentium, Sacrosanctum Concilium, and Gaudium et Spes, something that any theology student should be reading. These are landmark declarations in the midst of the 20th century, especially concerning the council's ecumenical posture towards Protestants as estranged brethren. We, as non-Roman Catholics, or myself as a non-Roman Catholic, would note as particularly significant. Is this movement in the Roman Catholic Church perhaps the best indicator of the new dawn of this period of world Christianity? Last but not least, and perhaps best known to an evangelical audience, would be the International Congress on World Evangelization of 1974, already alluded to by Dr. Green in his fine lecture. The International Congress on World Evangelization took place in Lausanne, Switzerland from July 16 to the 25th of 1974. Billy Graham chaired the leading committee of the conference, and more than 2,300 evangelical leaders from 150 countries participated in the meeting. Dr. John Stott, whom the more and more you study, quote, world Christianity, the more John Stott seems to be lurking in the background with these other giants in the field. John Stott was the primary architect for the Lausanne Covenant, the document produced by this Congress, a document that famously affirmed that, quote, evangelization requires the whole world to take the whole gospel to the whole world. Did I say that right? Evangelization requires the whole church to take the whole gospel to the whole world. Evangelical missiologist Ralph Winter was also a participant at the Congress and advocated at those set of meetings that mission strategists no longer focus on unreached nations because national borders were no longer a meaningful way to differentiate and to locate where mission work was needed. Rather, the focus should be on unreached people groups. And when you use that language of unreached people groups in your classes, a missions class, you're using Ralph Winter's language there, formulated at this famous Congress. All right, let me give you an option G that I didn't give you during our first that first rundown of the various possibilities that I'd like to work through with you, and that is something else the beginning point for world Christianity? You see the steadfast gaze of Picasso looking at you. Whenever I see a Picasso painting, it seems to me that the artistic genius behind it was achieved partially by standing way too close to the subject. Brings sort of a sense of intimacy into the painting, but it also distorts terribly what's visually represented. And history is very much like that. If you're standing too close to it, you're going to start painting it in a very Picasso-like fashion. the narrative will spin apart on you. It doesn't become compelling and synthetic. It sort of dissolves in your hands or at your writer's pen or keyboard. Are we too close to what we're trying to describe to actually bring in the tools of history to make sense of this? That's entirely possible. After all, think about this. We think of the Renaissance as an established historical paradigm, and of course it is, but that was established in the 19th century by Jules Michelet and Jacob Burckhardt. It was 200 to 400 years after the events that they actually established firm language to describe it historically. Are we too close to know what's taking place? It's entirely possible. But let me now give you the answer key to this very difficult question that I've been teasing you with. When does world Christianity begin? Well, actually, I don't have the answer, but let me take you to the questions behind the questions, and these are also the questions that I would like to ask the panelists to discuss with me in a moment, and that are these. I think, actually, you can give all the questions there, Tim, thank you so much. I think the questions lurking behind the major question are these four, two of which describe the past of world Christianity, and two of which describe the future of world Christianity. So if we're to articulate world Christianity as a historical reality, I think these are the major factors that we need to begin to sort out. First question would be, how large is the influence of classical Pentecostalism? Because of Pentecostalism appearing at about the same time that world Christianity begins to move in a noticeable way, because of the amazing speed of Pentecostalism's growth, and because of its very optimistic forecast for the future, because it appears that it will continue to grow in large numbers in the near future, Pentecostalism becomes a chief suspect, if you will, of looking for the beginning points of world Christianity. Should we tie the beginning point of the world Christian narrative to Pentecostalism? Now, there's also problems with doing this. The chief problem would be that Pentecostalism seems to be a loose, theologically, a loose coalition of independent bodies. And so, is what we're seeing in the, quote, global south, is that genetically, if you will, and I'm using that in an ideological sense, so I'll continue perhaps with that word is best, is what we see in the global south clearly and intellectually tied to Pentecostalism, or is their apparent agreement, is it really a trick of appearances? Are they independent movements that are simply acting in the same space at the same time and with many of the same mannerisms, and so we look at that and say it's the same thing, but will later years reveal that actually there's a disparity here in what classical Pentecostalism is and what ultimately will become known as world Christianity? I think that's the first question that needs to be sorted out. How large is the influence of classical Pentecostalism on world Christianity? Secondly, I think the other question, and let me respond to that. If you take this factor, question A, and give it a very strong priority and say that classical Pentecostalism, in fact, has a very large portion or a large amount to do with the development of world Christianity, then probably you're going to answer the question that I gave previously with answer B. The Azusa Street Revival then becomes the correct place to begin this world Christian narrative. Let me direct you to my second question behind the question. How large is the influence of the Protestant missions work of the 18th and 20th centuries? Let's not forget them. Bring Latourette back into the room. What about the great centuries of the 1800s, 1900s? That should have probably said, no, that is correct with Latourette's definitions there, the 18th and 19th centuries. How significant is that play? All of the great missionaries that you know about, David Livingstone, Hudson Taylor, et cetera, are going to be participating in this very long 200-year project to bring the gospel to the uttermost places of the earth, seen from a Western point of view. We shouldn't forget that. Is that missionary heritage directly tied to the growth of Christianity around the world? Is, in fact, what we're seeing and identifying as world Christianity, is it the fruit of many thousands of sacrificial lives given during those ages under Protestant denominations and mission groups headed out from the West. How large is the influence of the Protestant mission work of the 18th and 20th centuries? If you say it's very large, if you give that answer a priority, then you're probably going to be identifying the World Missionary Conference in Edinburgh of 1910 as the likely suspect for when to begin this era of world Christianity. Now, those two questions that I've identified here speak to where world Christianity has come from. Let me quickly introduce the next two questions, which speak about where is world Christianity going. So I'll direct your attention to question 3. Is world Christianity ultimately a unifying or a diversifying force? Do we see world Christianity exerting centrifugal or centripetal forces on Christian bodies, if you will? Are we spinning out or are we spinning in? Is the universe growing or is it shrinking? Is world Christianity, in fact, going to bring about, sort of fulfill an ecumenical promise that was in the air back in the early 20th century? Is this going to bring the church together, or is it going to continue to spin the church apart in its diversity? What's happening here? Is the universe growing or shrinking? And is the number of groups, is the number of denominations that we could anticipate 100 years from now, do we anticipate that to be a larger number or a smaller number than it currently is? Is this a unifying force or a diversifying force? And here, you've got two options. But if you see world Christianity as a diversifying force, you may tie this back to the Reformation. The Reformation permanently began a diversifying influence on Christianity that is only continuing and perhaps accelerating today. If you respond to this question by saying that world Christianity is a unifying force, you're probably going to trace the beginning points to it back to the 1948 World Council of Churches, or perhaps to the 1910 Edinburgh World Conference, Missionary Conference. Lastly, 4, will world Christianity ultimately claim either Roman Catholicism or Protestantism as its primary theological progenitor? Now, in the moment, we're celebrating the tremendous diversity and freedom that comes with world Christianity, and that's wonderful. I want to celebrate that too. But 200 years later, people peering back on this age will be drawing intellectual connections. They will, that's what historians do. If historians are doing their job 200 years from now, they'll be seeing intellectual trajectories over great spaces of time. And what we're calling world Christianity will not be an island unto itself. It will have a history. It will be tied to something that came prior. And if that history develops in an established form, is this a movement within Protestantism primarily? Is this a movement within Catholicism primarily? I think that's one other very significant question that needs to be discussed. Okay, I would be delighted if we could bring our panelists into the room because these questions are too much for me to answer. Let me give an introduction to our panelists. It's our privilege to have with us Dr. Alan Ye, missiologist who specializes in Latin America and China. He also has academic interests in history, classical music, homiletics, social justice, the California missions scene, and the Maya culture, Jonathan Edwards and Adoniram Judson. He serves on the board of directors for American Baptist International Ministries, earned his BA from Yale University, MDiv from Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary, MTH from Edinburgh University, and DPhil from Oxford University. Alan has been to over 50 countries on every continent in order to study, do missions work, and experience life in another cultural context. We are so glad to have you with us, Alan. I'd also like to introduce Dr. Byron Klaus. After 20 years on the faculty and administration at Vanguard University of Southern California, Dr. Klaus was named president of the Assemblies of God Theological Seminary in Springfield, Missouri in 1999. Previous to serving at Vanguard, he served local churches in California, Texas, and Illinois. While at Vanguard University, Dr. Klaus also served as vice president for Latin American Child Care, a child development ministry serving over 80,000 children in 21 nations in Latin America and the Caribbean. He's written a number of books published with groups such as Baker Bookhouse, Moody Press, Loggian Press, Regal Books, Hendrickson Publishers, Regnum Books International, and Rutledge Publishers. It's a delight to have you with us, Dr. Klaus. And lastly, but certainly not leastly, Darren C. Marks is with us today, Assistant Professor of Theology and Jewish Studies at Huron University College at the University of Western Ontario. He holds degrees in Science and Theology from the University of Toronto and advanced degrees in Theology from the University of Oxford. He's written a number of books, including The Blackwell Companion to Protestantism, also Shaping a Theological Mind and Shaping a Global Theological Mind. Dr. Marks, thank you for being with us as well. I would like to give you three the opportunity to begin questions at any point, either for me or for one another, or simply comments.
All right. I'm going to just start by saying that I probably wouldn't do the historiographical. I think it's a bit of a trap. And as a theologian, I'm actually more interested in the pneumatology that involves the phenomena of world Christianity. But we'll talk more about that as we go through. That's sort of my opening salvo.
First of all, let me say thanks so much for acknowledging that there is a younger tradition that has been part of what God sovereignly has been doing in the last 100 or so years. I think that that's a significant piece. I certainly, as a member of that tradition, would not want to argue that from Azusa Street has developed world Christianity. That would be a bit presumptuous. But I do think that it is an important part of the story as it presently unfolds, and certainly think that there are some reasons why there has been an explosion, particularly in the 20th century, of a movement from what we might call Christianity as predominantly centered in the West to predominantly being centered in the majority world. And I think that the tradition I belong to, the Pentecostal tradition, has something to do with that, but certainly not exclusively. So I would want to say thanks for even acknowledging that. That's a big move.
Thank you, Dr. Klaus. And actually, if I can get you to do a little work here for us, sir, would you be willing to articulate? So, what is the relationship there, in brief, if that can be done, between the 1906 Azusa Street revival and what we're experiencing in world Christianity? Could you take a stab at articulating that for us, sir?
Yeah, I think that the growth of the Pentecostal movement has much to do with an urgent eschatology. I grew up, for instance, hearing an articulation of, in fact, one of the first scripture verses I ever learned was in John 9:4, I believe, work while it is day, for the night cometh when no man can work. And so what we have then, are you still hearing me?
We can still hear you well.
Okay. What I think has happened is that there was an emergence of a movement who radically gave themselves to sacrificially going to the ends of the earth. And I think one of the things that happened was that a worldview that acknowledged there was something beyond what we saw with our eyes, that there was a supernatural dimension, played into the worldview of most of the world that they were going to. You didn't have to convince people that there, in fact, was a spiritual world. There were gods everywhere. There were forces fighting it out in the universe. And with that acknowledgement, I think there was a message that was proclaimed that logically played into the worldview of the localities in which these missionaries were heading. And I think that's one of the pieces. I think another one of the pieces is that sooner than later, and this is not just a Pentecostal issue, but I think sooner than later, this the whole church taking the gospel to the whole world, part of the impetus of what was growing in the world. That, in fact, it wasn't just Western missionaries who had means, who were taking the gospel across boundaries, sociological boundaries, or regional boundaries. They believed that the gospel that they had received was something that they had to perpetrate themselves. And so what you have is you now have, particularly, you get to the mid 20th century and you start seeing people who previously were the object of our missionary concerns now becoming subject of that. You had people doing cross-cultural work that emanated from Central America, that emanated from Argentina, that emanated from China and Indonesia and Nigeria, and you find, in a sense, people no longer being the object of missionary effort, but becoming the subject of that themselves, becoming initiators. So I think that there's a variety of things that happened in the 20th century. Certainly, this urgency of missionary endeavor, the belief in the supernatural, plays into an explosion worldwide that Harvey Cox called in his book Fire from Heaven in the 90s. He called it a religion made to travel, and basically predicted that the 21st century wouldn't necessarily be Pentecostal charismatic, but in fact would have elements that acknowledge the supernatural as part of the DNA of Christianity as it would be expressed in the 21st century.
That's extraordinarily helpful. Thank you, President Klaus. Alan, yeah, I'd like to give you the floor if you have opening comments.
Sure. I think there's two things I want to comment on. One is the definition of world Christianity. As you mentioned, there's a debate between, global and world. This is usually seen as Todd Johnson versus Lamin Sanneh. But also, not only what do we call it, but also what is the world, right? You could argue that the world Christianity existed in the first century because the gospel went to Europe, Greece, right, Asia, Turkey or Asia Minor, and Africa, Egypt, right? I mean, it was present in all those places. But at the same time, when the problem is we use these labels like Asia. Well, Asia stretches anywhere from Turkey to Japan, right? And so, the gospel clearly wasn't in Japan in the first century, but it was in Asia Minor, right? So can you say, well, the Asian Christianity has existed since the beginning, or can you say Asian Christianity is a relatively late development? So, and I think in the first century we obviously see Asia Minor, but we don't see the later Far East Asia, right? Another thing about your question about those different, what is the answer for the periodizing of world Christianity? What's the start? You gave 6 possibilities, and then you threw in a 7th, which was something else. I think I would take a stab at the something else. The main reason is because the other 6 all have Western roots, all right? And I'm not saying that world Christianity owes nothing to the West. I think it does owe something to the West, but at the same time, I also believe that world Christianity are indigenous movements, and to say that they are all copycats of the West, I think is too much. Certainly, there's a lot of credit to be given to missionaries, but Mark Knoll wrote a recent book called "The New Shape of World Christianity," and his thesis in that was that, and he's the preeminent historian of American church history, and so it's interesting that he writes a book about world Christianity at this point. He's written a couple more since, but this was his first stab at it, his first foray into the subject, and his thesis was that it's not so much that the rest of the world, the younger churches of the 2/3 world, are actually copying American Christianity, but he says that they parallel American Christianity. So what American development, the factors that caused American Christianity to grow in the first century or two of its development, you see the same factors contributing to the growth of world Christianity today. So it's not so much that it's just a carbon copy, but it's like the same ingredients are going into this and causing the church to grow in the majority world. And I think that's really interesting thesis, and I think I buy that.
Now, Dr. Yeah, let's go at this. I have a very small Western mind. and I've got a test writer in the room right now, I need a multiple choice answer to when world Christianity began. So if it's something that didn't take place in the West, how do you name it? What do you call it? And please tell me how I can get it into a multiple choice exam.
Well, I don't think there is. I know this is going to disappoint you, but I don't think there's an answer to that. I think that world Christianity doesn't have a definitive starting point. That would be so nice if there was like a neat, date, like Martin Luther nailing the 95 Theses on the door at Wittenberg in 1517. I mean, that would be wonderful, right? If you could just, what was it? Halloween, right? That was the day he did it. So, but we don't have a definitive starting point. I think it was very organic. You might, take Azusa Street, for example, right? You can say, well, there is a definitive starting point to that, right? I'm from Los Angeles. I live in Los Angeles, so Azusa Street is just in my backyard, practically. And, I often bring my students to go see the site. What is interesting about Azusa Street is that, while it gets the majority of the credit for being the birthplace of worldwide Christianity, of worldwide Pentecostalism, there are actually, if you talk to scholars, there are several different theses for what's the actual origin of Pentecostalism, right? Some people point earlier to before Azusa Street to, so you mentioned William Seymour. Well, William Seymour's teacher was Charles Parham, right, who actually started Bethel Bible College in Topeka, Kansas, and January 1901 is when this whole holiness movement from Wesleyan Methodism started coming up. So, you might say, well, that was actually the start of Pentecostalism, not, Seymour and Los Angeles. But then Walter Hollenweger came up with another, he says, well, that's too American-centric. He says he came up with what he called a polycentric thesis. This is the Hollenweger school. And he says, look, there was a Pentecostal revival in Wales in 1903 and 04. There was one in Pentecostal revival in India in 1904 and 05. There was another Pentecostal revival in Chile in 1906 to 07. There's no connection with these with Azusa Street in America or its missionaries, right? These are indigenous, homegrown revivals. So to say that Azusa Street was the birthplace, well, it seemed like the Holy Spirit was just working kind of simultaneously in lots of different places in the world at the same time. So I would say that this is true of world Christianity. Is there any connection with the growth of Christianity in sub-Saharan Africa versus as compared to China? I don't think there's any connection, but they just both happen to boom at relatively the same time, and through the work of the Holy Spirit. And so, I mean, certainly you can say probably in the last 50 years, okay, roughly, that's when it really took off. But I don't think I can pinpoint one event or one date when it started, right?
Very good. Thank you, Dr. Yeah. Dr. Marks, you had some very interesting theological questions that you began to introduce us to. May I give the floor back to you, and may we begin that reflection?
Yeah, that's for sure. I certainly agree with Dr. Ye that the historiographical issues that you raise, or the origins, are primarily concerned with Western identity. And to answer your question, both theologically but also in terms of giving a test, I would say Pentecost. That's the beginning of world Christianity. The reason for that is a theological reason, which is that that's a point in time in which the church begins to self-discover itself in its own linguistic, cultural ways. And so, for example, you have a church in Ephesus that can speak as Ephesian Christians. You have church in Jerusalem that can speak as predominantly Jewish Christians. And so I think at that point you begin to trace the thread of history, or the thread of God's action, all throughout the beginning of the call of Abraham. I'm a Jew, I'm speaking as a Jew, and that all the way through to the time of Jesus, and then the church's self-identity. So to me, the world Christian question is a pneumatological question. It's a question of the Holy Spirit. It's a question of how does a language group, a cultural group, begin to speak adequately of its own understanding of its relationship with providence, with God. That's the theological question. That's what I would wish to explore. I think what we're seeing in the 21st century and the 20th century is merely just the ability to pay attention to these events. we mentioned China earlier, and we know that there has been Christianity in China in one form or another pretty much since the 11th century, by some scholars' estimations. But certainly there is a Chinese church that we haven't even encountered in the West yet in terms of its theology. We don't even know what it's going to look like because we're not really there yet. So that's the theological foundation. I think Pentecost starts it, but I think that it's a pneumatological question. It's a question of what does it mean that God's Spirit is allowing groups to speak both of their prehistory before, in the Christian context, encountering Christianity, but also speaking of that reality in their midst.
Thank you. Dr. Klaus, Dr. Ye, would you care to respond to Dr. Marks?
I tend to agree with both my colleagues here that I'm really uncomfortable with checking A, B, C, D, E. It's all of the above for me. And I think particularly the response that says Pentecost is a place where you begin world Christianity, I really agree with that. I think that it's when you have the various peoples who were there on that day, I think that that's what you have as in a sense, an initiating point where the gospel will go to the ends of the earth. So I'm an all of the above guy.
Okay.
Just for the sake. Oh, go ahead, Dr. Yeah.
Oh, okay. So in response to that, while I would say that there are multiple origins of world Christianity throughout history. Okay?
Absolutely.
So,
absolutely.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So Pentecost is one of them. But, okay, let me take the history of missions in China, for example, history of Christianity in China. One could say there are actually 4 origins of Christianity in China, right? The first is when the Nestorians arrived in, the 7th century, Alopen, and then Christianity almost completely died out in China. And then the Jesuits came, Matteo Ricci and such, and then Christianity died out after that, and then the Protestants came, Robert Morrison and James Legan Hudson Taylor, and then Christianity died out again after that, and then the house churches arose, right, the Three Self Church and all that. So are these things linked, or are these like 4 different origins of Christianity? Depends on whether or not you think Christianity completely died out, or was there remnants that connected them. But I would say something similar, let's say India, right? What's the origin of Christianity in India? Was it Thomas the Apostle who came in the 1st century, in the Mar Thoma Church, or was it the Jesuits like Francis Xavier and Robert de Nobili, with the Portuguese and Italian colonization of India? Or in sub-Saharan Africa, was it Frumentius and Edius, from the very early church in Ethiopia, or was it the scramble for Africa in the 19th century with, the European colonialism? So I'd say that it's all of the above, right? So there's multiple layers of the beginnings of world Christianity. Pentecost is one of them, right? And but I would say that depending on whether or not you think these different movements, these different origins are linked or not,
Yeah, I just want to clarify that I'm using Pentecost as a moment of theological construction,
right?
Which you can point and sort of say that this is the beginning of an articulation in a specific cultural, linguistic, philosophical, whatever you want to speak, milieu that allows him to talk about their experience with the absolute, with God, with Jesus of Nazareth for the Christian context. And I think that one of the things that I would push very strongly is that world Christianity is not come of age yet. It's not come of age yet for the simple fact that we have only begun in the West to pay attention to the theologians who are speaking from, say, a Hindu perspective and trying to work through that cultural linguistic expression of what does it mean that Jesus claims to be the Messiah. These are the questions that will establish them as a world Christian voice that stands independent in itself. And this is no different than what we see in church history, right? Between Orthodoxy, Latin Christianity, the Jewish question, Neoplatonism, et cetera, et cetera. It's only when that moment is achieved that you can sit down and say, well, now we can define what this is, because they have spoken for themselves.
Good. I think I hear a consensus merging between all you three, which means I'm going to be your opponent, and I want you to respond to this. If world Christianity really begins at Pentecost, and then really there's nothing new about it, and most disgusting of all, world Christianity really becomes a Western enterprise through and through, because it's merely the West awakening to a reality that's already been always there. Take me down.
Well, let me contest that one part of your statement, which is has always been there. I don't think world Christianity has always been there. I think it was there from in the beginning, and then we lost world Christianity for a while, especially after the year 1000. So the latter part of the Middle Ages, and then it revived. So what I would say is, I would use the word ought. Christianity ought to be world Christianity, as seen from the beginning. Pentecost shows it to be so. But then we lost our way. And I think, or the reality didn't reflect the intention from the beginning. And now we've recovered it. So that's what I would say.
Appreciate that very much. Dr. Klaus, Dr. Marks, do you care to make closing remarks?
I'll just say amen to what I just heard.
Yeah. Well, here, I'll be the contrarian. I just don't think that God is actually ever asleep. So, you know, I guess I kind of bristle theologically with the idea that Hashem, that God is dependent upon human beings to achieve the mission of God. I think that God is always active, that God remains viable, even when the church, the Jewish community are unfaithful. And so I'm kind of always bristle about this idea that we need to kind of help out a little bit. So I don't think that we ever lost anything. I think that what you see is an awareness and an awakening, so I agree with that statement, rather than a loss of something. And I think that if what you're describing, Dr. Ye, in the medieval period is the rise of a monolithic Christendom, even that's kind of problematic historically, but I think that it just tells us that we became myopic. You know, to use your Picasso illustration, we were looking at the picture too close. But God has always been active. God is continuing to be active, and missions often just stumbles onto the field and finds God already active. I think that kind of works for a theological understanding of it as well.
I'm extraordinarily grateful for all of your time. I'd like to thank Dr. Alan Ye, Associate Professor of Intercultural Studies and Missiology at Biola University. I'd like to thank Byron Klaus, Dr. Byron Klaus, President and Professor of Intercultural Leadership Studies at Assemblies of God Theological Seminary. And I'd also like to thank Dr. Darren Marks, Assistant Professor of Theology at Huron University College. It's been our delight to be able to host you today. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.